So awe is onomatopoeic, right? This is a word that describes by its very sound what we're experiencing when something is striking us as awe-inspiring. It means that your jaw drops, your eyes open, your mind opens, your heart opens, and the sound is exactly like it sounds. Ah. And it's partly because you're trying to make room for a new experience. So one of the definitions of awe is an emotion that arises when one encounters something so strikingly vast that it provokes a need to update one's mental schemas. Say that 5 times fast. Research from Stanford and many other places, that experiences of awe are not just fun and trippy. They actually cause people to be more altruistic, to think of new solutions, to be less impatient, less materialistic, more satisfied, and feel like they have more time. So these are good for you, these experiences of awe. Dacher Keltner at The Greater Good at UC Berkeley and his collaborator Jonathan Haidt say that awe has 2 fundamental components. One is a perception of a vastness, and the second is a push to accommodate. So those of you who have been in Psych 101 probably remember Jean Piaget as the developmental psychologist who talks about assimilation and accommodation. And what this is when a child encounters something new, they have the choice of either assimilating that new thing into their current meaning structures or to broaden their mental structures to accommodate the new information or the new experience. So when a little child who's never seen a zebra but has seen horses looks at this picture, they say, stripy horse. It's a striped horse. And then a teacher, or they go to the zoo, or they go on safari, and they realize, oh, there's a zebra and a horse. So they actually have to expand their mind to accommodate the concept of zebra. So when you have an experience of awe or wonder that makes you want to learn makes you force that accommodation, that is what you are doing too. You're actually literally broadening your mind to make room for the new information. So one of the problems is that and it's not really a problem actually, we are hardwired to tend toward assimilating, and that's for cognitive efficiency. We want everything we run into to kind of slot into our current meaning systems. So we'll look for what's familiar, we'll name it, we'll categorize it, we'll put it into something that we currently understand. And our brains are actually wired that way so that we can be more efficient and not constantly be moving through life with every new experience having to completely reform our worldviews. So this is a good thing, except when it comes to you trying to change a worldview or you trying to help change somebody else's worldview. Then you're battling millennia of hardwiring against it. So some of the research that demonstrates this is that studies of scientists and of science students show in their brains that the brain learns more about data that supports their existing theory and tends to resist data that goes against their existing theory. So what happens in the fMRI is when somebody is presented with a piece of data that agrees with their current meaning system, the parts of their brain associated with learning light up. When they're presented with material that goes against their current meaning system, the error detection parts of the brain light up. So you've got a little bit of a ways to go. And so what pushes us toward, and this is otherwise known as confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of your existing beliefs or theories. So I will show you something about how fun this is. Maybe you guys have seen this before. Probably one of you in here made it.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. And I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head. And it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. and I'm not sleeping very well at all, and all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Come on, if you would just...
Don't.
Try to see things my way. Do I have?
All right, so when I say we are hardwired to not take into account information that we don't want to know, we are seriously hardwired. And some of you are probably familiar with the research on inattentional blindness, where they had college students look at a video of a basketball game and said, how many times has the ball been passed from one team member to another? They all count 15, 18, 21. What they miss is a full person in a gorilla suit walking into the middle, beating and walking out, and you've got like 85% of people not seeing the gorilla. So this is kind of how we are, and like I said, there are pros and cons to this. Okay, so when we look at research on awe, there are some ways that we can measure it other than just asking people, are you having awe? One is facial expression coding systems called FACS. This is probably actually more like surprise than awe, but you get the picture where little muscles, whoops, thank you. Little muscles are being judged on the face to show the lower jaw drop, the outer brow raise, the inner brow raise. So we can look at people's facial expressions as they're encountering stimuli to see if they're having awe. We can also look at goosebumps in the lab with the piloerection meter. So you are basically sitting in a chair with a very still arm with a light on it that's a camera that's showing exactly how many goosebumps you're getting. And there's some really cool validated stimuli that make goosebumps reliably. Like there are specific chord changes in symphonies throughout millennia that in like 80% of people causes goosebumps. And so this is some of the stuff we're working on in the lab to measure awe. So what I want to move from is awe to aha. So aha is kind of like awe, except it starts with awe and then it goes ha. And if you have done martial arts, you know that ha is prana. Ha is the life force. Ha means I'm doing something or I'm about to do something. So there's something very different from perceiving something and having that receptive state of awe and then going, wait a minute, aha, I know what I'm going to do next. I know what this means. I know how to put this all together. So we're really interested in this aha moment too, when things all of a sudden become clear, a creative solution comes up. And this is kind of like the difference between empathy and compassion, if you guys have done any studying on this, where empathy is feeling with someone else, feeling for someone else. You get that sense of resonance and you might feel sad for another person. Compassion is feeling with and for someone else and mobilizing an intention to do something about their suffering. So the difference between an awe moment and an aha moment is the aha moment means I'm about to do something about what I just learned. There's a form of therapy that is mindfulness-based, and how many of you have practiced mindfulness or are familiar with mindfulness? Okay. So this form of therapy is a mindfulness-based therapy like other ones, but it's called acceptance and commitment therapy. Because what we've found in our research, my colleagues and people around the world, is that when you're doing mindfulness to try to work on behavior change, like diet, exercise, quitting smoking, quitting drinking, doing things that are good for you, doing good things for the planet, mindfulness ends up not actually being enough. You've got to have the mindful platform and then enact a commitment toward your deepest values. So acceptance and commitment therapy is you first accept and then you commit to action toward your new values. So what does this all have to do with what we're talking about here? Well, what I believe and what my colleagues at the Institute of Noetic Sciences are hypothesizing is that when you have that awe moment or that aha moment where you have a reorganization of your worldview or you connect with some completely new insight, it may not just be your brain reorganizing itself and learning in a different way. It may be that there's something about the experience you're having or the state you're in that's tapping into a different level of reality and a different source of information. So spiritual traditions throughout millennia have talked about an interconnected fabric of reality that connects everyone, that's sort of like this unseen three-dimensional spider's web. In the Hindu tradition, they call it Indra's net. And there have been all kinds of other religious traditions that talk about this. And when you have experienced your own meditation practice, you may have also experienced this, or if you've done drumming, or if you've done psychedelics, or other things like that, where the boundaries of your body feel like they're disappearing, the separation between you and other people feels like it's disappearing, the sense of the normal rules of space and time go away, so time can feel really short or really long. You might feel like people who are distant around the planet from you feel like they're right next to you in spirit. So we've talked about this in the spiritual traditions and in subjective experience, but science hasn't really looked into that dimension of reality very much. And that's really what we're up to at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So the other thing we're up to is, like Mikey said, trying to determine how is it that people experience major transformations in their consciousness that change their worldview fundamentally to one that can no longer engage in behaviors that benefit themselves while harming others. In other words, what causes or stimulates, or what are the ideal conditions for a natural process to take place where someone is not just because they shouldn't, or because it's a rule, or because they don't want to be seen doing it, but they actually can't engage in behaviors over and over that they know harms others but benefits themselves. How do we give people that mind expansion experience? So how many of you have read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Does this make me super old? Okay, good. If you haven't, you should. They have this thing in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is actually a kind of a torture device that puts you into a little phone booth, and for one split second, it puts the entire universe in there with you, and it has a little tiny dot on a little tiny dot on a little tiny dot on a little tiny dot that has an arrow that says, "You are here." And once you really get your complete insignificance in the grand scheme of things, the point is to make you crazy. So that's a torture device, but in fact, people who have had experiences like that find that they are able to loosen up from things that cause them a lot of suffering earlier in their lives, like attachment to their egos, like worrying about what people think about them, like worrying about how much they're going to acquire and how much they're going to achieve and how much they're going to possess. And instead, they start to think about things more like meaning and joy and beauty and art and hope and doing things in their life that enhance thriving for everyone on the planet. So these experiences of awe, again, they're not just trippy, they are transformative if we use them correctly. So the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where I'm the president, was founded in 1973 by the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the 6th person to walk on the moon. And he recently passed away in January. He was an amazing man, MIT-trained engineer, a Navy pilot. He was one of the first scientists to go to the moon. So before that, it was almost all kind of Top Gun pilots. So he was going up to do this science mission. And on his way back to the Earth from space, he's in the space capsule, and he has the window seat. And the space capsule is rotating in what they called barbecue mode, so that one side of the capsule isn't facing the sun so long that it starts to melt. So they're doing barbecue mode, and he's seeing the sun and the earth and the moon and the stars and the sun and the moon and the earth and the stars. And he's overcome all at once with an epiphany, where he has this experience that I've been describing to you. The boundaries of his body disappear. He realizes he's interconnected with everything he sees, that the molecules that make up his body are the same as the molecules that make up the space capsule and the stars and the sun and the moon, and that there's some kind of a light or divinity or intelligence, or what he later called consciousness, shining through everything, that it wasn't just a random assortment of stars bumping into each other that created the universe, but there's some kind of an implicate order. And he felt like he knew this just as much as he knew anything he had ever been taught in school, anything he had ever been trained for at NASA. He felt it deeply to be true. And when he came back to Earth, he found the Greek word noetic to describe that form of inner knowing, knowing that you love your children, for example, or knowing something to be true and having, it could be 1 million people telling you it's not true and you would still know it. That's what noetic means. So when we talk about noetic sciences, we're talking about shedding light on those inner wisdom experiences and seeing if they hold something meaningful for us. And like Mikey was saying a little bit earlier, our society has advanced to such a tremendous degree with technology and science, but in a way it's inadvertently taken us away from that inner wisdom and that noetic knowledge. And even our education and healthcare systems have become completely focused on just the material parts of reality as the most important things. When you read about the science of being human, what you're reading about right now is 95% what's happening in your brain, not necessarily what's happening in your being. And so when he came back to Earth, he founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and when I talked to him last before he passed away, what he said was, we've been taught that the universe is made of matter and energy, and I'm pursuing the belief that the universe is made of matter, energy, and consciousness. And it's this third domain that we have not explored. We've explored the depths of the oceans, every corner of the earth. Now we're exploring outer space, but how much have we scientifically explored inner space? And where it really becomes important is that when you think of the problems that are facing society, think about a problem right now that is the most concerning to you on the planet. Go ahead, take a minute. Whatever you're thinking of, it's unlikely that it's a natural disaster or a virus. It could be, but likely whatever you're thinking about finds its roots in some way that humans are behaving, either toward the earth, toward each other, towards children, imprisonment, environmental degradation, inequality of resources. All of it is happening inside human consciousness. Almost every health problem we're facing now has to do with the way that we are treating ourselves or that we're treating each other. So when we talk about training the rigorous lens of science on inner experience, it's not just because it's super cool, which it is, it's because it's important to the survival of humanity and the thriving of the planet. So this is our team of researchers and fellows, and I would be remiss if I didn't let you know that almost everything I'm going to show you came out of this team. Very little of it is my own personal research. We think that we've got one of the largest scientific teams, most multidisciplinary, high expertise groups studying frontier topics in consciousness. And what I mean by that is investigating the idea that maybe consciousness isn't solely a byproduct of brain processes locked inside of our individual skulls, but that there is some extensive aspect of consciousness that goes outside of ourselves too, reaching out in space and also reaching forward in time, not just backward in time. So we know that consciousness matters. When I say consciousness, I'm just talking about what you intend, what you believe, what you imagine, how you train your attention, all those aspects, not only that you're aware of, but also the aspects of consciousness that you're not aware of, because you know we're like icebergs. We've got this much of conscious awareness, we've got this much operating under the level of conscious awareness. So when I talk about consciousness, I'm not just saying being awake or what you know, I'm talking about the things that you do that you don't even know that you know. So consciousness, let's say for example, meditation practices or the way we direct our attention change the brain. They change our hormonal systems, they change our immunity, they change the way our genes are expressed. So somebody who focuses on fear or hatred or stress or difficulty all the time is constantly flooding their system with cortisol. They're building up the part of the brain that has to do with fight or flight. What you experience and practice is how your body is built and how your genes are expressed. So you have a lot more ability to collaborate with your biology than we ever thought was possible in the past. We used to think your DNA was a blueprint and you just had to kind of go along for the ride. Now we know that the way you think and feel and pay attention is changing even the structure of your brain. People who meditate for 30 years have thicker cortices. So you can literally sculpt your neuronal connections and your brain and your body through just how you think and pay attention. So we know all that, but here's the really trippy thing, is you might be able to connect with other people through just your mind too, and you may be able to connect with people at a distance with your mind. And so how many of you have had the experience of what we call crisis telepathy, where somebody far away is having an experience and you have a minute where you're like, something's wrong? Often someone close to you, often someone that you're kind of resonating with or entangled with. How many of you have had an experience of the phone ringing and knowing who it was even though you haven't heard from them for a long time? Or kind of having a hunch that something is coming in the future that you have no way of knowing other than just that hunch? Or walking into a room or a place and feeling the energy in the room or the place and being like, this place is, I don't know what it is, but I don't like it here. Why are all these things happening? Well, they could just all be imaginary, but at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we're betting that they're not imaginary, that in fact, they're sort of like electricity. So before we discovered electricity, it existed. It's been there from the beginning. It took us having to look at lightning and hair standing on end and the way that cells work to actually uncover electricity. The next electricity might very well be this interconnected layer of consciousness. So that's what we're taking a look at. Okay, so our consciousness affects each other when we're together, at a distance. How we think has maybe some effect on the physical world, and maybe even forward in time. And not only how individuals think, but how collectives think. So I'm going to give you just a few examples of this kind of research. Hey, you're not supposed to do that. Okay, so we have this 2-ton box made of steel in our laboratory, which is an hour north of San Francisco in Petaluma at the Institute. And it shields out any electromagnetic signals or radio waves or cell phone signals, partly to keep you in a calm space and partly to block off any idea of cheating. We have somebody in that receiver's chamber, and then we've got somebody in a distant room, which could be 40 feet away, 400 miles away. And we're showing the sender a video signal of the person in the receiving room. So the receiving person is just resting, just saying, be open to whatever happens. The sending person, we say, when you see a picture of the person in the room, send as much energy as you possibly can, and then withdraw it when the picture goes away and think about baseball or cheeseburgers or something. You know, send your attention, distract. Send your attention, distract. Well, what we find is that the person in the receiving chamber actually does have a change in their physiology when the person in the sending chamber is sending the intention toward them. It's small, but it's highly statistically significant. The other thing we'll do sometimes is put somebody in the sending chamber and then have a stimulus, like a really big light flash or a really big sound, and then we'll see if not only they have the response that we expect, but also the person that they're linked to in the receiving chamber. So this is an example of a signal in the sender's brain that is mirrored in the receiver's brain, even though the receiver should have no possible way of knowing when that sender is getting the stimulus. This is another brain image from a different lab in the University of Edinburgh looking at after a light flash. This row is the reaction in the brain of the person who sees the light flash. This is the echo of that in their partner in a completely distant room. So there's multitudes of these kinds of experiments we've been working on for 20 years. Dean Radin and Marilyn Schlitz were pioneers of these experiments. So we had for example, something we called the love study, where one partner had cancer, the other person wanted to help them. They enrolled in the study. We taught the partner without cancer a healing technique, and we had them send healing to the partner with cancer. And what we found was that when the partner was sending the healing, what we would have expected is the patient had no response. In fact, they should be relaxing over time. Instead, what happened is the patient had this kind of a response when they were getting the healing. Again, completely different. So many experiences like this. This is a meta-analysis of 122 experiments in 20 laboratories, a total of over 4,000 sessions, showing that all of the results above the line are significantly greater than chance in terms of having these kinds of responses. And if you do statistics and pull them all together, it's very much higher than what would be expected. So we also look at precognition, and so I'd like you to look at these images as they come up and just allow yourself to have your natural response to each one of them. Okay, so those images actually come from a set of images we use. We put someone in front of a screen, we display those images to them. It's completely random, even the computer doesn't know what's going to come up next. We see how they respond after seeing the image, which I hope some of you felt a little bit after some of those images. But then, more interestingly, we look at what were they doing right before the image. And what we show is that people who are, at the times they're being shown very emotional images, like the gun or the bird in the oil spill, there's a pre-sentiment. There's a reaction already starting, even though there's no way that they could possibly know what image is coming. And as I said, even the computer doesn't actually know. So this is true in pupil dilation. This is true in galvanic skin response. Many areas of our system seem to know 300 milliseconds to about a second before a survival level image comes up that it's on its way. So this is an example of the reaction after the emotional image. This is a calm image. And what you can see is even before the stimulus comes, the body is already starting to ramp up to the forthcoming emotional image. And what you can imagine, there would be perhaps a genetic selection for this, because those people who even 300 milliseconds before a stone was going to hit him in the head and kill him, ducking out of the way, would be selected for over time. So it's very possible that we've got this in us somewhere. Similar data here just showing that the body does respond more before emotional images. Same thing here with a big light flash. And so what we also find is that people who engage in meditation practices seem to perform better on these tests. So this was an experiment where we looked at the brain after a light flash or after a sound. So after a light flash, the visual part of the brain lights up, and after the sound, the auditory part of the brain lights up. What we were seeing was, does the meditator's brain know a little bit before the stimulus whether it's going to be sound or light? And the answer was yes. So there was some, we don't have time right now to go into everything, but you can see that on the top is controls, people who didn't have a meditation practice, no difference between the light flash and the sound coming, whereas this was meditators up to 1,000 milliseconds before the stimulus, their brain is already starting to detect whether it's going to be a light flash or a sound, even though there's no sign in the equipment or no way to cheat, basically. Okay, and then the last one I'll show you is this mind-matter interaction. So we've talked about mind-mind interactions across a distance. We've talked about time. Now we're going to talk about, does the mind have an influence on physical reality? And the way we've been looking at this is a double-slit optical system where there's a photon being shot down a tube between two tiny slits. And when it hits the back wall, you can measure whether the stream of photons is acting more like a wave or more like particles. And the quantum measurement problem, which is well accepted in physics, is that somehow when the system is being measured by a camera or somebody watching it, the photons behave more like particles. When it's not being observed, they behave more like waves. Well, what we did was we had people psychically watch the system, projecting just their mind's eye, not a real eye or a camera. And what we showed is that when people were paying attention to the system, it was more likely that the photon stream would behave like particles than like waves. And so attention alone was seeming to influence the system at the quantum level. So really, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, do people have something along the line of Jedi powers? You know, is there something real to the idea that people might be able to someday not just have these random events where they feel someone in trouble from a distance or know who's calling, but if we were to cultivate those abilities, maybe human potential includes our ability to be able to do that. And I would just say, if we didn't have pianos or we didn't ever teach anybody the piano, there would be no piano geniuses. If we don't teach people and we don't have the equipment or the augmentation to help people with these abilities, it's not strange that we don't have them walking around all over the place. So how many of you did just come back from Burning Man? Nice. So you might be aware we've had an experiment for the past 4 or 5 years at Burning Man that is trying to detect changes in collective consciousness and whether that affects the behavior of random number generators. And Erica Biune is here, I see, who is one of the architects of this project, and her partner Shannon Bailey. A lot of our team worked on this very, 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 very hard. Mikey probably knows taking an experiment to Burning Man takes a heck of a lot of work. So our scientist, Lauren Carpenter, just came back yesterday from our 5th Burning Man collective consciousness experiment, which was basically looking at when the man burns and everybody shifts their attention toward that happening when the rest of the week is fairly much chaos of attention, is there a change in the output of truly random number generators? Now, Lauren Carpenter is the co-founder of Pixar Animation Studios, and he's been interested in this for a long time. When he retired at Pixar, he brought me to his retirement party and held both of his Oscars in his hand and said, I spent the first half of my life revolutionizing film, and I'm going to spend the rest of it revolutionizing the study of collective consciousness. And I was like, yay, go Lauren. So we inherited him from there, and he's also a burner from, I think, the very, very, very beginning. He's got a golden ticket. This is the machine that Shannon and Erica and lots of other people built with Lauren, and it's evolved over the 5 years. So we're super excited because this time is the first time that all of the machines worked for the entire time and collected data for the whole entire time. So we get to look at when people have a shift in their collective consciousness, does it impact physical reality? Or is there an association in physical reality when everybody's focusing on the same thing? What we're trying to get at here is if we all got in sync about how we were viewing the world, if we all got in sync around compassion and love and harmony and kindness and beauty, it wouldn't just show up in our behaviors toward each other, although that would be great. It could also show up in just our collective resonance, just like bicyclists when they're catching each other's drafts. It could be that we can all support each other by just how we think. All right, so some of you, I'm sure, in the audience are like, yeah, right. I would just say this goes back to the awe and the aha, and allow yourself to consider the possibility that we don't know yet everything there is to know about human potential, and that we do not yet know everything there is to know about the nature of reality. So totally happy to argue data points with anyone. We've got about, I don't know, 200 published peer-reviewed scientific articles in the medical journals about this. We do reach often a barrier publishing our results in medical journals and academic journals because there's a major stigma and taboo against even talking about these kinds of things. And part of my job is to try to make people feel a little bit less threatened and more comfortable. But I can tell you, man, you give talks like this in a scientific conference and people get pissed. You know, they don't just disagree. They're like, what are you talking about? You know, you are personally taking down civilization. And then you take them out for a beer later that night and they're like, okay, this one time. You know, and I'm like, dude, that's completely unfair. So keep your mind open. I will end with the fact that the aforementioned Lauren Carpenter up at the IONS campus has just created our new virtual reality lab under the auspices of the IONS Innovation Lab, which is being directed by Julia Mossbridge, who's been a scientist with us for about a year now. She's been doing work on what we call transcendence technology. And we're looking at how we can use mobile apps, software, devices, virtual reality to induce awe, to induce experiences of aha, to provide the ideal conditions to augment mindfulness so that it's not just a receptive state that stays with you, but actually moves you toward an active mobilization. And so we're really excited about that. You can learn more about that through Julia and Mikey. How am I doing on time? Am I done? Okay. So the IONS here, an hour north of San Francisco. It's beautiful. It has 100 beds. It's a great place to bring a retreat or a training. We've created a page just for you guys, noetic.org/consciousness hacking, where you can go after this, and we've curated about 5 different little videos and articles that you might be particularly interested in. Every single thing we do is funded by donations, so if you happen to be one of those awesome startups that made it and sold it and you're retired at 26 and you really think this is awesome work, we're one of the only places in the world that is doing it. And when you give to IONS, you're actually leveraging money in a way that can't be leveraged anywhere else. So please talk to me afterwards if you're in a position to contribute. If you're not at a high level position to contribute, you can also join our membership, kind of like Mikey's. It's $10 a month. You can also just give us your email address. And I'll just show you one video to end, which is another way you can get involved, is that from time to time we have hosted by Mikey and Julia hackathons or hackations up at the campus where you can come have organic farm-to-table food, hot tub, massage, yoga, walking the labyrinth at dawn, and then be completely enslaved to program consciousness transcendent technology apps. So I'll just show you the little video from there and then I'll be done.
Interesting app is because a lot of people are together with no.
Hold on.
So this is haccation, which is really an experiment, sort of like the idea of a hackathon on one side and a vacation on the other side. What we're doing is working on SciQ, which is a smartphone app that will let people on their smartphone test themselves on their psychic abilities. We love being with all these people, and I would say many of them are already my friends.
We decided that we wanted to build an app, but we wanted to do it with a group of people who were committed to also not only working in the space of logic and rationality, but also who were interested in working in the space of compassion and heart and spirit and mind. And we found those people. I feel very lucky we found those people. It's very exciting.
What's happening here is people are voluntarily congealing. They're coming together with no immediate reward to forward an idea out into the general population, out into the world. They're not doing it to be popular, they're doing it because they believe in it. Ideas like that are exciting.
These ideas, which have been fringe for a long time, are actually beginning to become a bit more mainstream. And so now we're trying to bring the scientific community and also popular audience together to actually research this themselves. The reason why PsyQ is an interesting app is because a lot of people are carrying around computers now on their hip that are practically as powerful as laptops or desktops. And it gives us the opportunity of collecting a huge amount of data from a lot of people. I can tell you that the nature is amazing. The location is perfect. It's very conducive for this kind of event.
It's exciting to be around not only a bunch of smart people, but a bunch of people who are dedicated to bringing consciousness and way of being into the work dynamic itself. So whatever's being created is actually being created from the space of consciousness expansion and larger awareness. So that sort of interaction makes not only the process itself fun, but the product itself also bigger and bolder.
All right. Yeah, so thanks again to Mikey and Julia who made that all possible, and shout out to Nora and Gareth and a few other people here who did that. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. We have time for some questions.
Okay.
Do we have a microphone?
Oh, be sure to pick up your little Ion swag sticker on the way out.
Do you want to pick or do you want?
Go ahead, you do it.
My question is, with presentiment, RNGs, and a lot of that other research, is there a unified theory or working theory that supports this, particularly around RNGs?
Well, there are a number of theories. So we have hosted a series of meetings called the Physics of Consciousness meetings that are looking into the potential theories that might be explaining some of these, but there's not a overarching theory that explains everything yet. Thank you.
And my question is around, I know that there's also a number of scientists who are, like the Noetic Foundation and so forth, who are skeptics, but at the same time interested in testing and validating claims in this space. And so far they haven't, to my knowledge, really reproduced any of these results.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you had a comment as to why that was the case.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, a lot of these results have been reproduced dozens of times, and so I would invite you to look at meta-analyses of things like remote viewing in the sense of being stared at, and telepathy and precognition in mainstream journals. There is sort of a myth that these are all unreproduced and not real. And what was the foundation that you mentioned? Yeah, the Randy Prize is a little bit of a stunt, in my opinion. I do think that there are skeptics out there who are thoughtful and intelligent, and then I think there are irrational skeptics, and I believe that Randy would fall into the zone of an irrational skeptic. And you know, one of the best phrases that I've heard about this is, you know, somebody talking to a head of one of the NIH divisions after a day long of presenting data. And he says, well, I'm not convinced. And they said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, there are no data that would convince me. So that is actually not skeptical, that's just irrational. So we welcome thoughtful, intelligent skepticism, especially when people have actually read the papers and are making some critiques based on the methodology. But if people are making critiques based on the topic, I am not interested. So what I like to say is there are no unscientific topics, there are unscientific methods, and I'm willing to talk about methods with anyone. And a lot of times those conversations improve our experiments because we go, oh my God, you're right, we got to fix that. So totally open to that.
Mix it up a little, come to the other side.
Hi, Cassandra, it's great to see you again. My question for you is, you know, I'm sure the questions that scientists have is always about statistical methods and is it, you know, all value and stuff. And I was wondering if you've done your work with maybe psychics, maybe they have a little more power, maybe you'll get a better value or something. I'm just kind of doing our phone there.
Yeah, we do. We have brought in a lot of very talented individuals into the lab, and they do have better results. It's just like anything you practice, you're going to get better at. So if you're someone who plays soccer or you're someone who plays an instrument, you're going to be better at it. And it seems to be a couple things. Okay, this is totally speculation, just saying. This is going into speculation now, which is that it seems like people who are really talented, it's not necessarily because they're more psychic. It's that they're better at getting their narrative mind out of the way, and they're better at focusing. And they're better at focusing without a lot of effort. So as soon as people start trying really hard, and like when you see in Star Wars somebody using the Force and they're like, you know, the whole effect seems to disappear. So it seems to be more of an effortless resonance that causes good results. And then it's just very tricky because then you think, well, okay, I'm going to get totally into effortless, you know, resonance, and you can't do that either. So it's hard. But we do have very talented people who come through, and we do study, for example, mediums who are research certified mediums, so they've been kind of vetted. And one of the things we want to do with our apps, PsyQ, or I think now it's called Sensei, is do hundreds of people, thousands, millions of people playing the games, and then contact them and say, okay, you're in the top 1%, would you come into the lab? So the multiple gaming might allow us to pull some very talented people. Yeah.
Probably special capabilities, special sense.
Yeah.
So in order to basically make a strong statement, it's not just basically doing an average or broad.
Mm-hmm.
It's not basically focusing on the people who are basically. But we also say basically that we do not only have consciousness in humans, we have consciousness in many aspects.
Oh yeah.
Let's say focus on animals.
Yeah.
Precognition, there's definitely cases where animals have much higher precognition.
Yeah.
Have you done any studies with that? Can you validate things? Can you say something about that?
We haven't done any animal studies at IONS, but we have one of our fellows is Rupert Sheldrake, who's in London, and he's done quite a number of studies on animals. One of his books is called Dogs Who Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. So he did these studies where somebody's watching the dog at home, and then the person will leave at some random time, and their dog will invariably kind of get up and go to the door, even though it's not a predictable time of day. He also worked with a really psychic parrot one time. Oh, and there's also some really cool experiments with finches, where you can have a lot of finches in a cage, and right before something big is going to happen, they all start tweeting more, and so they have like a collective presentiment.
Thank you for the presentation. On a similar related note, is there any work being done with indigenous populations across the globe that have been practicing a very similar ideation of interconnected reality through consciousness?
Yeah.
And or any research on them neurologically?
Not as much as we would like. Our scientist Arnaud Delorme has gone to Tibet and India to look at monks and to do studies of precognition and presentiment and telepathy with monks, and there does seem to be a bigger signal, but not overwhelmingly so. Like if we had the answer, we would go to Randy and be like, all right, dude, this dude can do it every single time. So it's, you know, it's a better performance, but I think what we really need to do is enhance our methodology, enhance our instruments, and help our instruments detect these things better, which is, I think, where the hacking community comes in too, is if we can get some really smart minds on this, we might be able to innovate things that would help us detect these things better. We did work with, you know, a Himalayan yogi, for example, who came in and he had the ability to be basically in a sleep state while he was still awake and conversing, and he had some pretty extraordinary abilities. So I think it's a really good line of research to pursue.
Is your interest mainly in like showing that these, you know, showing in a public way, like that these sort of like miraculous, you know, kind of little bits of magic?
Mm-hmm.
You know, things like, I mean, in like spiritual tradition, there's like magic and there's like miracles. You know,
Right.
There's like the cities, you know, there's like the powers that we develop.
Yeah.
And what, like a meditator for like 70 years, or you know, as like a whatever, as like a magician, that don't actually, you know, like sigh, for example.
Right.
So those are all like great things, but like in a spiritual tradition, like those are the things exactly that you should like.
Right.
That don't matter. So like,
Right.
what are the? I mean, so like, are you also studying the things that are like what? How do you set up experiments to like actually figure out the other, like how people find out their destiny by following a spiritual path, for example?
Well, we have, yeah, I mean, I think I get where you're going. We have three main program areas. One is extended human capacities, which is the psychic abilities and precognition and all of that stuff. The second is how do we induce or support major positive transformations in consciousness through spiritual practices or spiritual experiences. And the third is consciousness and healing. In other words, how does our mind interact with our own body and with other people's body to aid in healing? So all of that is sort of the basic science work. It's like bench, laboratory, survey science, where we're trying to figure out how it ticks. And then the purpose of it, in the end, is twofold. One is to understand consciousness better so that we can help people direct and transform their consciousness in ways that help them become healthier and their neighborhoods and communities and society and eventually the world. And the second is just what I talked about at the beginning, which is this is all very interesting and cool, and I could do this for the rest of my life just because I find it fascinating. But the reason that I'm driven to do it is because I believe that consciousness and the way we think about things and the way we direct our attention and what we believe is possible is the only thing holding us back from eliminating a lot of the unnecessary suffering in the world. So if we can show what's possible and that what we're doing now is just rudimentary and a little bit uneducated and barbaric in many respects, and that there are possibilities that are far beyond that. We can start to open people's minds to solving some of the major problems we face.
Thank you so much for the work that you do. Really inspired. I've seen and read a lot of experiments and just things proving that this sad phenomenon exists and that it's real. I was wondering if there's any sort of trajectory as far as quantifying certain techniques as far as enhancing sad abilities and these sort of things.
Yeah, I mean, part of our mission at IONS is not just to do research ourselves, but it's to foster the growth of the field around the world. So there are a few different ways we do it. One is by innovating methods and measures. One is by holding field formation meetings where, for example, Julia Mossbridge, and I think Mikey helped with this too, is bringing together a group of scientists who are working in various domains of transcendence technology and getting them all in the same room so they can share information and boost it. But the thing that I think Dean Radin, our chief scientist, and many of us are very passionate about is giving permission to young students and young scientists to be able to investigate these things without being ridiculed and ostracized and told that their career is going to go down the tubes and they're never going to get tenure. Because the truth is, you can investigate these things rigorously and scientifically. They're interesting to almost everybody, actually. And if you can rest on the quality of your work, then nobody can take that away from you. So that's our kind of encouragement to young scientists. So we are starting some online courses and trying to bring together a lot of people who are very credible and very well respected in the field and say it's okay for you to study these things, and we will support you through this initial phase where sometimes you're going to get laughed at or ridiculed, but don't worry about it. If you're interested in it, go for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.